Hello everyone, good evening, and thank you for attending this online NCLA event. My name is Rachel Hewitt and I'm a lecturer in creative writing at Newcastle University, and I'm also the Deputy Director for the Newcastle Centre for the Literary Arts. And I saw some of you earlier in the term when it was my great privilege to interview Helen Lewis. So it's lovely to be back now, and even lovelier to have Helen here again and to see, well, not that I can see the audience, but I'm going to imagine that I can see the audience. So it's nice to be back. This is our penultimate event of the semester. Next week on Wednesday, the 16th of December, NCLA is hosting an online end of degree show in which postgraduate students on Newcastle's MA in creative writing and the MA in writing poetry will be reading from their work. So you're all very welcome to join and support these emerging writers and to enjoy their work. So you can find out more about that event and you can register on NCLA's website, which is www.newcastle.ac.uk/NCLA. Now, when I last saw you, it was to interview the writer and journalist Helen Lewis about her wonderful book, Difficult Women, A History of Feminism in 11 Fights. That event was the first of a series of NCLA events in which the interviewee becomes the interviewer, inviting a writer of their choice to discuss their work and practice. So tonight, Helen is going to be in conversation with her interlocutory choice, the author Charlie Gilmour, who in turn will be interviewing his choice for NCLA next semester. Helen is going to introduce Charlie, so I have the pleasure of introducing Helen. Helen Lewis is a writer and journalist who was deputy editor of The New Statesman and is now a staff writer at The Atlantic. She's a regular panellist on the BBC's News Quiz and on Have I Got News For You, and she regularly hosts The Week in Westminster. She was the inaugural Oxford University Women in the Humanities Research Fellow, during which time she worked on Difficult Women. Now, usually at this point, I'd ask you all to make Helen and Charlie feel very welcome by giving them an enormous round of applause. But instead, perhaps where you are at home, smile broadly while I hand over to Helen, who will introduce Charlie to begin tonight's event.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I'm slightly alarmed by the thought of hundreds of people sitting at home smiling into their webcams as they watch this either now or on catch up. When Rachel asked me who I'd like to talk to for this series, my mind immediately went to Charlie Gilmour. Like many other people, I had seen the picture of him swinging from the cenotaph during the student fee protest, and I registered vaguely that he had gone to prison for it. Fast forward a few years to 2016, and I get a pitch at the New Statesman where I was then working from a familiar name. And when I read the piece on what synthetic drugs like spice have done to prisons, what struck me was how beautifully written it was. There was no trace of self-pity, just someone using their own experiences to illustrate a problem experienced by people most of us are happy to forget about. Well, Charlie has now taken that elegant prose style and that clear-eyed self-reflection to his first book, Featherhood, a memoir about adopting a magpie, tracking down his biological father, and becoming a dad himself. Charlie, welcome. And why don't you start by setting the scene and reading from the prologue to your book?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to finally meet you screen to screen. I've got the book here, which is just on top of your book. And correct.
I was going to say, don't read from my book. No one wants to hear that.
No, yeah. That would be weird and inappropriate. So I thought I'd read the prologue, which is quite short and just gives a good flavour of the book. Somewhere in southeast London, a flightless young magpie tumbles to the ground. From below, it's hard to make out exactly where it dropped from. Its nest could have been high up in one of the plane trees that line this lorry-worn road, a bush-like bower hidden behind a green veil of leaves. Or it might have been tucked away somewhere in the jumble of semi-disused warehouses that clutter the area, an intricate formation of sticks and mud on corrugated iron and asbestos. Magpies construct their homes alongside ours, within sight but just out of reach, a magpie city superimposed on our own. It is a harsh and very human environment into which this bird has prematurely arrived. Cars with concertinaed bonnets and shattered windscreens wait in lines to be scrapped at the nearby junkyard. Fly-tipped fridges and sacks of rubble as immovable as boulders block the pavements. Puddles of spring rain shine purple with petrochemicals, and overhead, clouds of smoke and steam billow from the chimney of a huge waste disposal facility that incinerates rubbish around the clock. Juggernauts rumble past like thunderclouds, and the football fans at Millwall FC roar. The only animals I've ever noticed there are pit bulls and rats, although a little further afield, around the dump, there are flocks of gulls and pigeons, along with a fleet of raptors sleek as fighter jets that are employed by the waste disposal company to chase the other birds away. My partner Jana's workshop is just around the corner, in a leaky industrial unit on the edge of the junkyard. It's a part of the city that's full of secrets and surprises, but they're rarely cute and fluffy. A police raid on a neighbouring warehouse uncovers a cannabis farm one week, stolen motorbikes the next. A friend opens up a long abandoned shipping container and finds it crammed full of jet skis. Someone I once shared a prison cell with boasted of having dumped someone's sawn off limbs nearby. It's the last place on earth I would have expected something as yolky soft and bird bone brittle as a chick to turn up. The creature scuttles around in the gutter, lurching towards the curb like a drunk staggering down an alleyway. Magpies leave home far too soon, long before they can really fly or properly fend for themselves. For weeks after they fledge their nests, they're dependent on their parents for sustenance, protection, and an education too. But this bird's parents are nowhere to be seen. They're not feeding it, or watching it, or guarding it. No alarm calls sound as a large apex predator approaches with footfalls made heavy by steel toe-capped boots. That doesn't mean its parents aren't nearby. It could be no accident that this bird is on the ground. If food was running short, a savage calculation may have been performed, showing that the only way to keep the family airborne was to jettison the runt. The bird has stopped moving now. It crouches down in the gutter, shivering from dehydration and perhaps fear too. If nature is allowed to run its course, it will probably be dead before the day is out. The advancing human looms large as a tree trunk, sways uncertainly, and then, with a soft rustling, the bird's world goes dark. A couple of 100 miles to the west, and 3 decades distant in time, a young jackdaw tumbled from its nest in the steeple of a village church. Steel grey feathers, yellow beak, injured wing dragging along the floor. Jackdaws and magpies share family ties. The crow family, carrion kin. Someone, perhaps the vicar, stumbled across this injured young bird, boxed it up, and took it to the home of a local woman, an amateur animal healer. From there, the jackdaw found its way into the hands of the man who would go on to become my father. The magpie finds its way to me. Prologue.
I love that beginning. I love the idea of a magpie city superimposed on our own, because you're doing an interesting type of nature writing. It's not a kind of romanticized form of nature writing. It's a very kind of grubby urban form of nature writing for quite a lot of the book, right?
Yeah, but I mean, this idea that nature is something that only happens in the countryside is completely untrue. London, once your eyes are open to it, is there's a whole other population and other city playing and breeding and having families all around us. But it takes a certain something to see that city.
And tell me, so the magpie chick that arrived in your life, Benzine, as you call her, what immediate effect did her arrival have on your life?
Initially, I mean, my partner Jana brought this chick home. Her sister found it just lying in the gutter and scooped it up, and she brought it home. And initially, I was a bit pissed off because I grew up in the countryside, and I've sort of had had experience with what happens when you bring injured animals home, which is that, you know, you just get to watch them die. You know, squirrels and birds that have bashed their brains on window panes, you know, it never really ends well. But this bird, by some miracle, survived. And I didn't really know that much about magpies, or really that much about birds. And, you know, I was just amazed that a bird could actually have this much character. I mean, it's become quite, the sort of crow family has become quite trendy in a way, and lots of people, you know, starting to know more and more about crows. But it was a real revelation, you know, how bright and intelligent they were. So initially, it was just the very fact of this bird's existence that was sort of shocking. But then I made this discovery while trying to find out how on earth you look after a creature like this, which was that my biological father, who was this incredibly eccentric and charismatic poet who disappeared in the dead of night when I was a baby, had a similar experience with a jackdaw. And jackdaws are also members of the crow family, and it sort of set in motion this whole series of events that sort of ended in a deathbed reunion with me and my biological father, who's called Heathcote, and indeed my two long lost sisters. So when that sort of tiny bird came through the door, I couldn't possibly have predicted the effect it was going to have on my life.
Why do you think that Jana's sister thought you and she would be the people to look after it? What did she see in you that said these are good adoptive magpie parents?
I think it was just that she happened to live with a cat, and so she couldn't. And I think Jana kind of didn't really give her much option. I think Jana's the kind of older sister, and she's quite a forceful character. And so I think it was slightly. I think her little sister wasn't actually given much of a choice about it.
When you found out that your biological father had kept this jackdaw, what was your instant thought about what it told you about him and his character?
It was incredibly confusing, because, you know, this was a man who, in my experience, was completely incapable of nurturing, of loving, of you know, he'd sort of run in terror from a baby. And while I was looking after this magpie, you know, it's not the case that you just give it a few worms and then throw it out the window. I didn't know it at the time, but they become imprinted on you, which means they never ever leave you alone. It is very much like looking after a toddler, because they require constant attention. They're highly, highly intelligent. You know, they need to be interacted with constantly. And the thought that Heathcote had been capable of doing this with a bird, but not his own child, was sort of mystifying and infuriating. But actually was sort of provided an insight into him as a complicated human being, rather than him as this sort of idealized or demonized character. So it was sort of the something that happened that made me stop and think about his actual biography and his actual sort of psychological roots and his actual complications.
And your other father, your adoptive father, Dave Gilmour, is a big presence in the book. He adopted you when you were 3, that's right? Yeah. I mean, how do you now sort through nature versus nurture, and who you think of as your father? I mean, I'm just also interested, like, what is the language that you use about each of them when you're referring to them?
So, so my mum, I mean, in the book, Heathcote Williams is referred to as my biological father, and David is referred to as my dad, and that's pretty much how it's been in my life. You know, my mum sort of told me that one was nature and the other one was nurture, which, considering Heathcote Williams was in and out of mental asylums, and, you know, an alcoholic, and you know, a bit of a rogue as well, I'm not sure how helpful that entirely was, although it was a good way to divide the two parental roles. But yes, a lot of the book is about this sort of notion of fatherhood and inheritance, and what gets passed in the blood and what gets passed from hand to hand. And the conclusion, which is more of a statement of hope rather than fact, is that who you're raised by is more important than who you're made by. And that is more of a hope than a fact, because I'm not a genetic biologist.
Right, but and I don't think even they've sorted out amongst themselves at all. No. This is a very lowbrow question, but what is the hardest part of caring for a magpie? Because as I read the book, my constant theory was your house must have been covered in bird shit.
It was, yeah. I think that is probably the it's. I would not recommend to anyone that they raise a magpie. I mean, and it happened quite by accident. My partner brought it home, and I said, maybe we should call a vet about this, and she sort of poo-pooed as if I'd suggested hiring an electrician to change a light bulb. Because that's the sort of person she is. She comes from a sort of Soviet Ukrainian background, and I think very large, slightly chaotic family, where the ability to make your own fun and fix your own problems really came at a premium. And so we did a DIY raising of it, and then it became imprinted on us, and then simply would not leave. We took it to Sussex to let it go, and it flew up into the air and did a big circle and came back and landed on my hand, which I was both upset about and relieved about, because I absolutely adored this creature, and that it had this very strange connection with my biological father, who I'd spent much of my life trying to have a connection with and not been able to. So it was all wrapped up in all sorts of things. But I'm getting away from your question, which is.
But I really must press you on the bird shit. Like, what are we talking? Because there's a reference in the book about you putting the sleeping perch over a pot plant, which then dies.
Yes.
So I mean, and I suppose Jana knew exactly what she was letting herself in for. But it must have brought you into contact in a very earthy way, just with nature, in like it's not exactly red in tooth and core, but sort of browny, whitey, black in tooth and core, right?
Yeah, no, it was certainly grubby. And if you look at it on paper, it screams, it shits everywhere, it eats raw meat and worms. It doesn't actually eat all of it, because sometimes they're caching creatures, so they like to hide food for later. So you open your wallet to pay takeaway guy, and there'd just be some rotting mints inside your wallet, or put on your shoes and it'd be full of dog food, or she loved tucking things into the folds of clothes, so you'd put on your socks and they'd just be full of worms. It was certainly challenging, but looking back on it, those aren't the things I remember. I remember the beautiful things and the incredible privilege, even though it would have probably been better for her if she could have just shot out the window and away into the trees. But the incredible privilege of living in close quarters with another intelligence, an alien intelligence. And they're incredibly beautiful birds as well. I mean, when you see them in the trees, you just think, oh, there's a black and white bird. But up close, they're all the colours of the rainbow. They're fantastically beautiful birds.
Talk me through the feathers, because the memoir is structured around pin feathers and blood feathers and flight feathers. So it was not something I knew about at all. And the idea of them being inside kind of waxy kind of capsules that then have to be kind of pecked. I mean, I'm fascinated by this.
Yeah. Yes, the book is sort of structured into different sections which follow the development of a bird's plumage. And yeah, I mean, obviously birds are born pretty bald. And then the feathers burst through the skin, incredibly tightly rolled, like scrolls, and then they slowly open up. And birds do that every year. You know, they molt their feathers, and then they get these tightly rolled scrolls. They're called pin feathers, and they're also called blood feathers, that come up through the surf. And you'd think it would be incredibly painful because they're quite big, and then they have to pick away, and slowly the brand new feather is revealed. And you know, rebirth and birth are some of the themes of the book, so it felt sort of apt to organize it in that way.
And you seem to have spent quite a lot of time on magpie forums. There seem to be some quite intriguing characters out there in the magpie verse. Do they have it? Is there a name for people who are magpie keepers?
Yeah, it turns out that, you know, anything you can think of exists on the internet, including you know, people who cohabit with crows, crohabitators.
Yeah, that's what this film says.
I guess they don't really have a name of themselves. I guess, you know, crow weirdos probably, because, you know, although when I was sort of researching it, and it started off as a sort of, you know, great man history, because you know, initially the people I came across who had lived with members of the crow family, you've got Dickens and his ravens, Grip, and I think the other one was called Grip as well, which the raven from Barnaby Rudge is based upon. And Truman Capote also weirdly lived with a raven and wrote this incredible essay about it. Byron had a pet crow who he wasn't very nice to, actually, as he was unkind to many of the birds in his life. Mad, bad, and dangerous to crows. But then when you get to the present day, you know, actually, there's a whole hidden history of people who, for one reason or another, bend down to pick up an abandoned corvid fledgling, and then discover that once you pick them up, they're impossible to put down again. And, you know, there are hundreds of them out there, of people living with these birds in one way or another, and having similar, you know, it's fascinating seeing the sort of similar personalities playing out in different people's lives. Like, Benzine was obsessed with stealing cigarettes, and she would be quite devious about doing it. Like, we had a friend staying, and he had a cigarette tucked behind his ear, and she just went up to him and was just sort of cheeping and putting her head back as if she wanted him to stroke him, which he bent down to stroke her, and she just ran up his arm and pinched the cigarette from behind his ear, and then just flew off cackling. So she'd planned it, you know, forward planning, sort of, you know, which is fascinating to see that unfold, because you don't really think of animals as being able to deceive and plan in that way. But
it's one of the things I thought was an interesting contrast with Helen Macdonald's H is for Hawk, which you mention in the acknowledgements as being a kind of forerunner of your book. And, you know, that book to me is interesting because it's a book about control, right? So she's trying to learn how to master a hawk. And like, master is exactly the right verb for it. You know, it's about taking a wild creature and kind of breaking it like you break a horse in. And you sort of try a little bit to do that with Benzine, and Benzine just has basically none of it. So it seems that yours is much more of an analogue with human parenting, right? Which is where you can tell your children what to do, and to some extent they will sort of do what you tell them, but ultimately you can't control them in the same way.
Indeed, yeah, no, it was a disaster attempting to train the magpie like a hawk, which you know, was directly inspired by Helen Macdonald's memoir. When my biological father died, I thought, you know, one of the ways out of grief might be trying to do what she did, and Benzine just was not having it at all. I think because, you know, magpies are significantly more intelligent than hawks. I think hawks, although they're very intelligent at doing one particular thing, which is zooming in on rodents and breaking their necks, you know, they're not actually that bright at doing other things, whereas magpies are a bit more like us. They have a sort of multi-directional intelligence, and a will.
But was it good preparation for your own parenthood? The fact that you're living with an intelligent creature that basically I mean, that is parenting a toddler, isn't it? That doesn't do what they're told.
Pretty much, yeah. It definitely was, you know, very, very, very good preparation, both emotionally, but also in terms of some of the techniques that you have to use to sort of trick your magpie or toddler into, bending to your will, which, I often, when I'm trying to get, because my daughter she's nearly 2 now, and I find myself using similar techniques on her that I used on the magpie, which is just, distraction with a shiny object, or, giving a treat. And I think because there was some crossover with having a magpie and having a baby, that they sort of had similar fascinations. Like in her early life, my daughter was absolutely obsessed with worms. I think because I just had so many of them around. I used to have, boxes and boxes of worms lying around, which, the magpie was obsessed with, but she also, became absolutely fixated on them. And, it was quite weird, actually.
I mean, yeah, I was going to say that I imagine that when she was a baby, she was also hiding bits of food in your hair as well. Like that is classic toddler behavior. One of the things I really loved about the book was the twin time scale, because I think when you're correct me if I'm wrong, but my thing about the hardest thing when you're writing, whether it's drama, fiction, non-fiction, is it's about the controlled flow of information. How much do I need to set up this so the reader knows what's going on, versus how much can I land this at an emotional point that like this piece of information feels meaningful? And you have twin time schemes. So there's one in the present, which is adoption of Benzine leading forward to your wedding, and eventually Heathcote's death and the birth of your baby. And then the second time scheme, which is young Charlie and trying to reconstruct the past. How long did it take you to get to that idea that you were kind of creating a sort of braided narrative?
I sort of wrote it all down, and then actually I had a brilliant editor, Lettice Franklin at Weidenfeld, who just took scissors and did a sort of David Bowie songwriting technique, and she just went snip, snip, snip and threw it all in the air, and it landed like that. And that was actually, it's funny when you're writing a book, you sort of think that you're doing it completely alone, but actually it is always a collaboration with, your editor, with every single writer you've ever read, with all the sort of critical voices inside your head. It is an enormous collaboration, and it was that was 100% my editor. I can't actually, I wrote it, but and I sort of had a hunch that, it would be good to do a bit more snipping up, but she was the one who actually quite boldly took the scissors and did that.
So which bit did you write first? What was the first scene that you wrote?
God, what was the first scene that I wrote? I think it must have been, it was this, the first scene that I wrote was when we took the magpie to Sussex, to my parents' farm, which is where I grew up, and opened the front doors to let her out, and she just flew in a big circle and came back. And yeah, that was the first scene that I wrote, and it was one of the chapters that the book ended up being sold on. And some of the chapters that I wrote last, I stupidly, or perhaps necessarily, saved the more difficult chapters till last. So sort of towards the end of writing the book, I sort of had to do, quite graphic or quite intense descriptions of my biological father's dying, and then my emotional reactions to that, my very, very, very emotionally intense but relatively short experience of the prison system, and also, basically psychologically falling apart and doing the things that led to me being put in prison. And I sort of had to do all those things in one horrible burst, which was not fair on myself and not very easy for the people around me, actually, because, those memories are quite hot to the touch, and going over them and going over them and going over them, which you have to do when you're writing. You have to keep going over stuff. And, it does put you back into that emotional state. And a friend of mine who is a much more experienced writer, his advice was just get really drunk at the end of the day, which I did. And I actually don't know if that was really good advice. I think it was poor advice.
They always, didn't they have a thing when they, like in exams, it used to be like if you revise drunk, it's fine as long as you also take the exam drunk.
Yeah.
And you think, I think this is just a fundamentally poor life advice. It's interesting that you mentioned those three sections, because they are, as you say, they are all of them brutal in their own different ways. I thought your description of your biological father's decline at the end of his life and then his death is incredibly moving because of its spareness. So there's a scene where you go and visit him in hospital and he basically sort of explodes in a shower of blood. There's just blood everywhere. And I thought it that was such, because it's not romanticized at all and it's not sanitized at all. And it fits with the idea of writing about, things honestly, about bodies, really, about the fact we're all kind of meat at the end of the day. It spoke thematically to the rest of the book really powerfully. One of the things I was interested in, because I was baffled by this when I started writing things down from my own life, was when you checked with other people, were your recollections of stuff accurate?
So I wrote this book in almost, except for my editor, I wrote it in almost total isolation and did not let anybody read it until the very, 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 very last possible moment. Just
Why?
Because something like this, which is so intensely personal and does involve scenes that, were quite traumatic to live through and certainly traumatic to revisit, the critical voice is so loud, and the idea of anyone reading these things is so horrific that was the only way I actually could have written it. And I don't think I could have done it any other way. But when people came to read it, they didn't, fortunately I hadn't got anything wrong. I mean, I did a sort of fact-checking interview with my mum about her early years with Heathcote and, my early life, because obviously I don't really have any memories to rely on for that. And that was very useful. Yes, so no.
No, I think it's interesting because you write, as you say, about the events that led up to you going to prison, and when you were in kind of, I mean, is it fair to say drug-induced psychosis? I mean, or related to, I mean, you were definitely mentally disturbed in the way that you render it in the book.
Yeah.
That you were sort of outside of yourself when
you
were doing that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, that was one problem coming to it is, how do you rationalize the irrational? How do you make sense to the reader of something that makes absolutely no sense to yourself?
The one thing I noticed about that bit when I read it, and I wondered if this factored into your decision not to write too much about prison, is that were you aware of not wanting to come across as self-pitying?
It's weird the way that this idea of self-pity is something that, I mean, I think people should feel more sorry for themselves. I think, one of the problems in British culture is that, we go around hoity-toity, everything's fine, I don't feel any emotions. And maybe that's not quite what, people mean by a lack of self-pity, but I think people could give themselves a bit more self-pity, but the keeping the prison section short, I just wanted it to be a very concentrated. It's quite tight. It happens across 2 pages, and I just wanted it to be a quite concentrated burst that would try and get people to actually feel the claustrophobia and the sort of constant hum of violence that you feel when you're in the British prison system. It's sort of 90% boredom, really, but that boredom tinged with the sort of constant feeling of threat. And it's a system that makes no sense if you think about the people that are going in and what it's doing to them, and the fact that those people are just going to be put back on the street, which, I sort of feel like this might be slightly controversial, but when people come before the courts, that's a golden opportunity to, this is a person for whom something is going wrong, and they have come to our attention, and we should think about a way to try and perhaps fix this person, instead of which people get thrown by the thousand into these sort of rotting Victorian institutions where they can only get made worse.
That was how I first read your work, was in connection with prison reform, and it's a subject that I agree. I for my Radio 4 series, I interviewed Chris Dorr, a QC, who wants basically to essentially abolish all prisons. He wants to replace it with something much closer to the Scandinavian model, where you have some things that are institutions that are like prisons, but lots is done by monitoring. And it's a very frustrating subject to cover. Like, I interviewed Frances Crook, who's the CEO of the Howard League for penal reform, a couple of years ago, and I went to a couple of prisons with her in Yarm up in the northeast. And you just look at the people, the demographics of the people who are in prison, and the fact that so many of them are illiterate. So many of them come from have mental health problems. Undiagnosed, untreated schizophrenia, things like that. And then you warehouse all these people, as you say, in a kind of great big, either kind of new build warehouse or weird Victorian galleries system like Wandsworth, and expect that you'll come out at the other end changed in any way for the better. It's just extraordinary to me. But because I know this is a very, I imagine, tactless thing to say to you, that part of me thinks it's quite good when either middle class or shelf elbow people get sent to prison for things, because then they get to come out at the other end and write about it. It's very rare that, the path that Jonathan Aitken walked, that Chris Atkins, whose memoir, A Bit of a Stretch, came out at the end of last year, that otherwise we just don't hear the voices of people who've been to prison at all.
Yeah, no, I think that is true. I mean, there are it's also quite a hard sell as well, because we're sort of who gives a shit about prisoners in our culture? It's they're sort of painted as evil criminals, when actually a lot of people in prison haven't yet been convicted of a crime, but are still being subjected to the same conditions. And those who have been convicted of a crime, could perhaps just use a bit of mental health help. So yeah, I completely agree with you on that.
It's I think it's a very difficult subject to tackle, because, as you say, the public mood. This was my essential question to Chris Dorr, was like, well, what's the biggest thing holding this back from happening? And he said, the fact that no one wants it. That's the thing. My argument here is both, on the statistics, absolutely unimpeachable, but also enormously unpopular. Before we get to questions, I've got two more things I want to ask you, which is, I love the portrait of your family in the book. I love your grandmother and her hatred of magpies, except for being won over by this one. I love the portrait of your dad, David, because he's everything that is the opposite of our idea of a rock star, right? And he comes across in the book as just, he loves having a family, he loves taking care of people, versus Heathcote, who I think did live up to our idea of the tortured genius. And do you think, is there a pernicious idea that kind of, if you're a talented man, that somehow is a kind of excuse note out of caring obligations or obligations to other people?
Yes, I mean, I think we were talking about this before, but I think the question of making art, and that being something that can't happen at the same time as performing care or domestic work, which men in the past often very happily subscribe to. I mean, when my biological father disappeared, one of his sort of parting remarks was to quote that Cyril Connolly line, which is
the enemy of good art is the pram in the hall.
Exactly, yeah. No more somber enemy of good art than the pram in the hall, which is from book he wrote in 1938, I think. And to an extent, I think when you're doing life writing, you do have to think about what you're willing to sacrifice. And when you're writing about your own life, there are going to be often real world consequences, because you don't live your life on your own. You live a life that involves other people, and the trauma that you experience is one that's shared by others too. And as difficult as it is for yourself to expose your own trauma, it's going to be doubly difficult for other people who don't at least have the consolation of being a published author, or the sort of catharsis that allegedly comes with writing about things like that.
Do you think you could have written this book if Heathcote was still alive?
I've been asked that before, and I really don't know. It would certainly have been a very, very different book. I think it would have been a much more frustrating book, because one of the things about this one is that although I never knew Heathcote while he was alive, and he sort of refused to let me know him, he was quite particular about keeping me away. He was a writer and he was a hoarder, and when he died, he left behind an enormous hoard of writing. And then, after his death, I was able to finally, to the extent that you can know anyone through the written word, get to know him. And that was an enormous turning point, for me personally, and indeed in the book, was getting a sense of the complications of this man's life, and that he didn't run away from his partner and his child out of any sort of rational hatred. It was very, very, very complicated relationship with his own father, who sounds like a monster, but no doubt he himself had a very complicated relationship with his own father. And you sort of unlock this chain of causality, which kind of undoes the notion of good and bad, really, which is a challenge. I have no idea how that would have been possible if he was alive. I do not know what this book would have looked like. It would have been a very, very, very different book.
Yeah, I mean, I when I was reading it, I thought that was interesting about how, in the sense that story is finished. You've got all the closure that you're ever going to be able to get out of him. You had, as you say, your deathbed, heart to heart with him. Were there other bits where you felt the pull of what was the expected arc of a book like this? I'm thinking about the bit where, because the premise, of the book like this is, I had a magpie and it solved my my fear of commitment.
Yeah.
And did it? And did you try and keep that complication in there, as well as trying to get to the emotional arc that is very satisfying?
Yes, that's something that my friend Rick Samada, who wrote a brilliant book about all sorts of things, but mental health and depression, and he was sort of having this exact same problem, which is you've written a book about depression and horrible traumatic things, and now everything's fine. And that's actually not quite how it works. And although you're on a sort of arc towards fine, and I think writing about things is a brilliant way of understanding them. Real life isn't quite as neat as that, and I hope the book doesn't really, it's not meant to have a sort of fairy tale ending. And I think it's important to stay true to life when you're writing books like these. You can't just, because it would ring a false note. Any sugaring that you do, I think the reader does pick up on.
I felt like that when I was writing the section in mine about me trying to argue with myself about whether or not to have a baby. I just felt that narratively it demanded to be like, and that is why I decided, I'm like, here's my beautiful daughter, she's here tonight. Or conversely, to go the other way and be like, and that's how I decided, as you say, the pram is the enemy of good art. And actually, I thought, I know what, I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave it as being like, because you have to, you have to kind of, not everything is boilable down to a pat, satisfying, but ultimately kind of quite narrow emotional arc. One more before I ask your audience questions, which is, it's interesting that you've kind of hit by accident a wave of fatherhood or boyhood kind of memoirs. Robert Webb's one was out a couple of years ago. Alan Davis published one to this year. It's not been traditionally, I mean, Karl Ove Knausgaard as well has kind of reinvented writing about fatherhood, I guess, but it has not been a kind of prestige subject for male authors. Did you read much, in the same way that I can think of a tradition of nature writing, the one you reference in the acknowledgements, to which this, you can put this in the context of, I'm not sure I can think of a context for fatherhood memoirs really beyond a couple of things in the last few years.
Well, when I was sort of gearing up to write this, which it took quite a lot of running up to, and in the early stages, I really wasn't sure what the book was about. I thought it'd probably just be a relatively light-hearted book about being friends with the magpie, and then it became quite different. And when I started to realize it was going to be more about fatherhood, there are some brilliant memoirs about fatherhood out there, but the one that was probably the biggest for me was Philip Roth's Patrimony, which
I don't know that.
It's fantastic, and it also speaks to this.
I have to say, I'm prejudiced against Philip Roth ever since my colleague went, you must read Philip Roth. He wrote a whole novella from the point of view of a breast, and I thought, I'm out. I'm sorry, I'm out. So sell me on Philip Roth's.
Well,
tough to say.
He's a brilliant writer. Certainly problematic, but it's just a sort of very, very, very tender, closely observed account of his own father's death. His father, who is this sort of incredibly charismatic, loquacious man, gets a brain tumor and slowly loses his faculties. And there's this scene where his father has shat himself, and not only shat himself, spread the shit everywhere. And Philip Roth goes to help him, and his father looks up at him and says, promise you won't tell anyone about this. And you're reading that on the page. And then, later, after his father has died, his father comes back to haunt him in a dream and says, you shouldn't have done it. You shouldn't have been writing that book while I was dying. And that really, really helped me think about the sort of moral quandary of, what sort of monster takes something like that and puts it on the page for an unknown reader? How do you overcome that? Why do you actually do a thing like that? And if writing things like that is supposed to be therapeutic, why do you then need to publish? But I think, the fact is that writing is not a selfish act, and writing these things down does, I think, it helps other people connect with their own emotions. Is, I think, the best way to look at it. Writing is not a selfish act.
There's a brilliant James Baldwin quote, which is about exactly that, which is about essentially that, we're all stumbling around in the dark, and it is of a great help to the suffering person to read, to find out that Dostoevsky understood exactly what they're going through 100 years ago. And I think that's a big part of it, particularly when you're talking about subjects like death in your book, or I wrote about divorce, and I thought that was a fascinating one, because I don't think, it's a pretty common one in whatever it is, 1 in 3 marriages end in divorce. It's a thing that happens to a hell of a lot of people, but it isn't, there's no argument around it, so it doesn't get kind of covered in the media in that sense. It's not kind of traumatic in an obvious way. It's still quite shameful. And so it's been really fascinating to me that one of the big reactions that I've had is primarily women coming up to me and kind of going, this is the first time I actually read about anyone else's divorce. Like, it just doesn't come up that much. And I think that's how I felt definitely about the end of life scenes, and that is that it is a great help to know that the feelings that you went through in a situation that you haven't ever really heard discussed are everyday human feelings. But you're right. But it is also so. I mean, the other thing I was thinking when you were talking about that the Susan Sontag essay on photography, in which she says photography has become a way of refusing experience. You keep everything at a distance.
Sure.
And I don't know if this is how writing functions for you, but sometimes it functions for me as this terrible thing's happening to me, but it's okay because it's going to happen in a book later, or it's going to happen in an article later.
Yeah.
That you already know, oh, this is weird and horrible. Like, but you can mentally sort of take yourself one level up to it as thinking of it as content, which is horrible and psychopathic, but also in terms of dealing with trauma, quite effective.
Yeah, it's it's basically it's a sort of artistic disassociation, isn't it? I mean, right. if what Nora Ephron said, everything is copy, but where does that leave you living your own life? If everything's copy, where's your life?
But I find that so funny when writers have a go at, all these people go and see the Mona Lisa and they just take photos of it, because you're like, that's what you do. Like, that's what we do all the time. Like, I don't look at the Mona Lisa and go, oh, the Mona Lisa. I kind of go, oh, I wonder if there's a piece in like the theft of the Mona Lisa and how that turned it into an icon. Like the little tiny bit of you is wearing away constantly.
Yeah.
I have to give you a question from the audience because we haven't got that long left. Which came first, the bird or the book?
Very much the bird. Yeah, I don't know how the book could have preceded the bird, because the book was about the bird. But
did you want to write a book about any of the other stuff that's in there at all?
No, I'd never thought about writing a book about Heathcote or any of that stuff. It was really this sort of completely bizarre coincidence of crows that got me thinking about both of our stories. And I sort of tried to, the sort of direction that this book could have gone was I did sort of try to connect with Heathcote about his jackdaw, and I wanted to get him to talk about his jackdaw as a way of getting him for the first time in my life to really talk about the past and to try and understand, why he went insane and disappeared. But he, I think, sensed, a trap and, was not having it. So I was sort of thinking about the two stories and how they were going to work. But it was only really, after he died, and then quite a while after that it actually started to make any sort of sense.
If you write another book, do you think you would write it in a similar style, genre, or would you try and do something very different?
I think I don't know. I think, your preoccupations remain the same, but I think, they come out in different formats. I'm working on a series of short stories at the moment. There are sort of around a similar theme, but also incredibly different. I think, you can't escape your preoccupations.
No, I agree. I think if you end up writing about the same things over and over again in sort of different bottles, and I don't know whether or not it's a good thing as a writer to understand what your great subject is. I think it's probably better to be stumbling around unaware of it and keep bumping into it rather than look it directly in the eye. Another question, which is that Helen MacDonald wrote recently that it's impossible to write about the natural world now without confronting the spectre of loss. We're losing so many species so rapidly. And personal losses often make us more alert to other forms of loss too. Did that happen to you? Did the losses of Heathcote and Bermondsey make you more sensitive to other forms of loss and grief, personal, environmental?
Yeah, Helen MacDonald is very interesting on that. She sort of talks about how it's quite doomy, actually, about how we have to sort of bear witness to the ecological destruction that's taking place around us and mourn it. Which it's incredibly depressing when you stop to think about what is actually happening. But the loss of Heathcote it didn't particularly make me more attuned to the ecological destruction happening around us. But the arrival of the magpie certainly opened my eyes to the sort of vibrant natural world around us, which in turn obviously makes you aware of how incredibly precious it is and how much is being lost. So yes,
I felt that when you described the farm, and there's a bit where you talk about just sinking beneath the water, and there are dragonflies and things like that, and I think that's one of the really I don't know if anyone will ever write a great book about. I mean, given that someone's written a brilliant book about fungi this year, by all
Yes,
accounts,
no,
the Melvin Sheldrake book is excellent. That the loss of insects is not glamorous, or it doesn't feel particularly poetic, but it is a kind of astonishing, actually, even from my childhood, how many fewer insects there are.
Yeah.
I'm just prodding you towards like a really great book about where you adopt you could just this time you could go straight to straight to adopting the worms, like a really great wormery.
Yeah, no, I've been after this book was written, I was sort of casting around and did think for a while about maybe a novel from the perspective of an ant, but then that's basically like Bug's Life, isn't it?
As I say, yeah, Ant's Life and Bugs. I think, yeah, unfortunately, no, but I think it's. I would definitely read a novel from the perspective of a bee.
Yes.
Collective intelligence is just a really fascinating phenomenon. But before I start supplying you with writing prompts, I think that's probably a good time to draw one final quick question, which is someone who wants a Spanish translation of your book. Is the book being published in other languages?
It is actually, but unfortunately not Spanish. But I would ask you to please write to a Spanish publisher and request a translation into Spanish, and then maybe it can happen.
Although I have to say that I had to explain some of the jokes about, I did have a Spanish translation of my book, and brilliant translator, but I had to try and explain your cheap jokes about Ian Duncan Smith to being a prat to people in Spanish, and be very careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
Charlie, it's a pleasure to talk to you. I love the book. I'm so pleased that it's ended up on so many books of the year lists, and I think it's really tender, and it's really vulnerable, and it's honest in the best way, in the service of kind of some greater truth. So thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to finding out who you're going to interview. Do you know who you're going to interview?
I've got a list, but I don't want to jinx it. But,
okay.
But thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been a real honor, and congratulations on your book, which is
great author real loving at the end. Yeah, no, it's all great. But everyone at home, please, whenever you raise your cup of tea or applaud, and thank you very much, Charlie.
Thank you everyone for coming. Now what do we do?